World building is really exciting for some DMs, but it can be extremely daunting for some others. If you barely understand how the real world works, then how are you expected to design an entirely different world from scratch? Well, first of all, world building doesn't need to be as hard as a lot of people make it out to be. There's no shame in using an existing world like the Forgotten Realms, or even something from another property like Middle-earth. And if you do want to use an original setting, then it's totally fine if you only detail the small region where you expect the adventure to take place. In fact, if you stick to a smaller setting, your campaign might actually be better, since you'll have more time to plan things like encounters and NPCs that are more likely to be relevant to individual sessions. All in all, world building isn't the most important aspect of being a dungeon master, and you really only need to do as much of it as you want to. Less than stellar world building probably won't break your game, but very strong world building can certainly turn a good campaign into a great one. And in my opinion, it's not very difficult to explain what makes a great D&D world. To me, every world should be three things: novel, believable, and adventure-friendly, or NBA for short. I don't think anyone's used that initialism before, have they? Well, who cares, I'm using it anyway, let's get into it. The novelty aspect basically means that your world should have cool stuff that your players haven't seen before. If your world is just Middle-earth with the serial numbers filed off and maybe a few superficial differences, then your players will instinctively wonder why they aren't just playing in Middle-earth instead. That's a world with way more detail and established context than your imitation will ever have. Deviation from convention will certainly help your world stand out, but you definitely shouldn't go overboard by actively trying not to take inspiration from anything. Many great worlds take something familiar and put just one key twist on it. For example, a world that's basically like Middle-earth, except that the Dark Lord has already taken over and left only scattered groups of survivors, can make for a great campaign. On a more individual basis, you can add novelty to your setting by looking at things like monsters and class archetypes, and seeing how you can twist their narrative role without abandoning the core of what they are. Maybe your world's trolls are the immortal guardians of ancient underground treasures, rather than just yet another race of marauding brutes. And remember, you're only trying to create a fresh experience for your players, not everyone on Earth. So if you find a cool setting element from a fairly obscure novel or TV show, then feel free to throw it into your world. The believability aspect is pretty self-explanatory. It should feel reasonable that your setting came to be the way it is. Some people say that believability doesn't even matter when building a fantasy world, since the genre inherently requires suspension of disbelief on account of having magic. I disagree. A setting without much care given to why its key components exist in the context of those supernatural elements is much more likely to feel artificial. It's less likely to immerse your players, and it'll contain far more loopholes for them to exploit. Plus, thinking logically about setting elements is just more likely to give way to layered environments and well-developed NPCs. Let's say you're designing a classic dungeon crawl, an abandoned dwarven stronghold crawling with goblins, drakes, and other nasty creatures. There are plenty of questions that aren't absolutely necessary to running the adventure, but can help make the dungeon feel alive, and can even lead to some creative encounters. For example, what do the goblins eat? Where's their water source? Do they share it with the other dungeon dwellers? And do they get along? Why do they inhabit this dungeon? And why did the dwarves leave it in the first place? Answering all of these questions can lead to a more vibrant atmosphere and potentially a fun social scene with the goblins. Just like with novelty, it's possible to go completely overboard by agonizing over the absolute most realistic consequences of D&D's magic system, which is a fool's errand and would probably result in the entire planet being populated by simulacra of whichever wizard first discovered the spell. But if your realistic touches don't come into conflict with the third entry on this list, then they're probably very welcome. The adventure-friendly aspect is probably the most important of all, and it basically means that your world should provide opportunities for the type of campaign you want to run. First of all, any D&D world should support the core D&D gameplay loop of exploring dangerous locales, fighting monsters, and gaining rewards. A world like Westeros allows for plenty of conflict in the form of intrigue and politics, but it doesn't really offer much in the way of unique monsters or versatile magic systems. If you want to run a campaign in Westeros or a similar world, it's totally doable, but you should use a system other than D&D. Some other settings do work well, but only for certain types of D&D campaigns. Middle-earth has monsters and ancient ruins behind every tree branch, but it's also a world with extreme black and white morality that's laser-focused on a single conflict. Basically, everything that would threaten the players is in control of the obviously and irredeemably evil Dark Lord Sauron, or potentially Morgoth if your campaign is set in the distant past. So if you want a campaign with lots of moral ambiguity, then this probably isn't the setting for you. Really, your world will probably be adventure-friendly as long as you don't view world building and campaign planning as completely separate endeavors. Campaign planning requires you to devise unresolved conflicts by definition, and to me, world building for role-playing games is basically just the process of formulating these conflicts as well as the overall vibe of the campaign, and then fleshing them out in the context of novelty and believability. So far, many of my talking points have emphasized the balance between the three NBA qualities. And yeah, I do think that a world with a moderate amount of each will fare better than one that's just through the roof in one category, but deficient in the others. A world that has tons of novelty but isn't believable or adventure-friendly will seem confusing and half-baked. A world that emphasizes realism and believability above all else is frankly boring, and a world with tons of plot hooks but no thought given to believability or novelty will seem hokey and contrived. For the most part, if you're thinking of adding something to your world that increases one of the NBA traits, then just take a moment to consider whether or not it hurts either of the others. For example, when I was a new DM, I decided that my world would have no dwarves in it. I don't remember exactly why, but that was just it, no dwarves. The absence of dwarves did add a little bit of novelty, but it also made the world less adventure-friendly, especially since I didn't provide a substitute for the dwarves as a player race and as a convenient source of dungeon builders. So it wasn't really a net positive for my NBA rating. On the other hand, an idea that I've implemented in a newer world is that most of the aristocracy consists of sorcerers. This decision was mostly driven by believability. If some people are just naturally gifted with magic and are also super charismatic, then it seems natural that they'll dominate society. It turns out that this idea also adds plenty of novelty, since it deviates from the default expectations of D&D. And it even makes the world a little more adventure-friendly, since evil aristocrats can now have powerful magic that makes conflicts more interesting. And I think that generally, the best world-building decisions are the ones that increase 2 or more of those NBA factors. So yeah, that's basically my 2 cents on what you should be striving for when creating a world for your campaign. I want to stress again that your world building does not need to be perfect to run a great game. If you're comfortable with the other aspects of being a dungeon master, then players can look past setting elements that seem a little derivative or a little contrived. But if you are planning on building or revising a world and just didn't know what to focus on, then I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.